Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
We in Indiana have been hearing a lot of tough talk lately about education. Governor Orr has called on the legislature to make a historic commitment to education. He went for the first time in his 6 years as governor to a legislative committee this week to ask that drastic action be taken. The consequences of failing to do so, the governor says, might well mean economic disaster for Indiana. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we're going to talk about how and why this has become such an immediate problem and the effect that the solutions that are proposed might have on students, their parents, taxpayers, and society in general. Our panelists today are Ray Sheely, professor of political science at Ball State University, Ted Kowalski, who is dean of the Ball State's Teachers College, and John Rouse, producer of this program and a member of the faculty of political science. Ted, is drastic action needed? Where have we been asleep too many years? Is indeed this problem that immediate, that serious?
Well, first of all, I think that educators by and large are delighted that there's been an awakening to the fact that there is a linkage between the prosperity, the economic prosperity of a state and the quality of its educational system. I think that's something that most educators have believed all along. I think one of the realizations is that we have become competitive now on a worldwide basis, and the importance of education has taken on new levels, and the governor, I think, realizes that to attract international businesses to the state of Indiana will necessitate evidence that we offer a quality public education system here in Indiana. So I think that it is important. I think the governor certainly is on the right track in calling for drastic measures to increase spending and support, but also expectations that our educational systems, when given these added resources, will produce higher levels of achievement among students in elementary, secondary, and even higher education.
Ray Sheely, these problems obviously didn't crop up overnight, but they now apparently have the attention of politicians, and that's when it becomes, I guess, a public issue, and the legislature certainly is concerned.
Sure. Well, again, the history of this issue, it's rather remarkable that indeed it was Ronald Reagan back in his first year and a half as president that first spotlighted education and educational quality in this country. Presidents tend to do that about every 20 years or so. Education seems to recycle, perhaps, as a major political issue. I think the political realities, though, are that there's a lot of rhetoric, and there's a lot of public officials that say, well, where's the action? In the case right now of Governor Orr in the General Assembly, there's some criticism on both sides of the aisle, both the Democrats and the Republicans in the legislature, that it's really, as the old saying goes, it's a day late and a dollar short on this. We've been talking education, particularly at the national level, the president has, since the early 80s, and now we're closing out this decade here shortly, as this legislative budget will, and indeed we haven't invested the resources up to this point. It's really, perhaps they're crying wolf out here, that indeed where's the action that backs up all of the rhetoric. Again, I don't think there's any doubt, though, that Governor Orr is very seriously committed to this. He would like this to be his legacy to Indiana in his final 2 years of office. As to whether or not he's got the votes to fund it, of course, that'll be determined.
Education, John, is something of a godmother and apple pie issue. Quality education, nobody can be against it, but as a practical matter, it's public policy established by politicians, established by legislature and Congress. You're talking money.
Yeah, but I think we should focus upon the definition of education, because of the four of us, three of us get our salaries or economic income comes from education. Education, of course, is that bridge between the past, in a sense, and also the future. In other words, how can we better meet the future, and how can we better retrain and retool and rethink, and how we can do our jobs better, be more happy at our jobs, or more self-fulfilling in terms of our jobs. So education then is kind of the bridge between where we are now and where we're going. And so that's the reason that education is so important.
Well, I guess the question is, where are we going? Is that, or do we have no real plan in Indiana, nationally, statewide, for where we're going? Is that why the governor is calling now for drastic action? Have we not done a good job of planning, Ted?
Well, I think that we've done a better job of planning in recent years. I think one of the real problems facing education is a point that John just alluded to, and that is really, what is the purpose of education? And a dilemma we have in Indiana and in the United States is that people simply do not agree on the answer to that question. If you look at the proposals that the governor is putting forth to the legislature currently, they express a bias that one of the primary purposes of education is to transmit knowledge to individuals who then become productive members of society economically and help the economy of the state. There are other people who believe that the primary purpose of schools is to liberate individuals, to make them critical thinkers, to allow them to operate as functional parts of a democratic society. It's interesting that the current trend right now, in my mind, is so similar to what we faced after Sputnik. Ray, you mentioned that we rediscover about every 20 years. I think that's true. We rediscover, and the catalyst seems to be some kind of crisis that scares everyone into action. And in 1957, 58, that was fear that the Russians were going to dominate space. Today, it's a fear that we are not competitive internationally in economic markets. And I think the real question is, will we, by infusing large amounts of money into the educational system, really improve it? And two, will we follow a similar path that we did when we put money into education in the early 1960s? What we did is, many of those reforms were very short-lived. And the country changed direction, and we suddenly became concerned with other kinds of things, and back to basics and fundamental programs were dropped.
You know, I think, in a sense, we're talking about formal education, but there is also informal education. It's sort of, I think of the comment by Lily Tomlin, who is the comedian. She said, if you've read a lot of books, you're supposedly well-read. However, if you've watched a lot of television, it does not mean that you're well-viewed. Perhaps society has really gotten caught up in the viewing of television, and perhaps we have gotten away from some of the fundamentals of reading, writing, arithmetic, and this kind of thing. It seems to me that this is kind of the bond that we have gotten in the last 25 years.
Well, sure, but Horace Mann also believed in the 3 R's. That's been the basic educational setup of this country ever since we first decided that we were going to publicly support and finance education. And that's always a nice thing to go back to. And anytime we see a problem, we can say, well, the problem is we're not teaching the 3 R's. I'm not so certain that is the crux of the issue. As a matter of fact, we haven't had, as Ted just pointed out, we haven't had a whole lot of systematic public policy thinking about education until recently. Really, going back just 2 or 3 years, because the public policy agenda during the recession of the early 80s was, how do we get out of this recession? Once that was solved, then we could continue to march into the educational area. But just as a couple of examples, we've never fully funded a school formula here in the state of Indiana. Our state legislature never has. Moreover, even more basic, it doesn't have a permanent funding formula. It's never accepted the elements. It's 26 elements in this formula that we have in the state of Indiana. By the time you compute it out, you need a computer to determine what each school district will be receiving in this state. And yet that formula has to be renewed from session to session. We've never put enough money into it to fully fund it, according to the expectations of most of the educational policymakers. We haven't had long-term plans as to where our educational system fits into the overall structure and desires and priorities of the state of Indiana. Now we're starting to just hit the surface of it. We've decided that, yes, as Ted points out, education has something to do with economic development. Economic development means we have to be competitive. All of these things fit together, which we educators have believed, again, for a long time, but the policymakers have not.
Well, Ray, let me ask both you and Ted, since both of you have devoted a great deal of your time to education. You as a candidate a couple of years ago, Ted is the leader of our School of Education here. Have we lost our sense of fundamentals or not? As a society, vis-a-vis education, have we lost our way in terms of focusing upon the fundamentals of education?
I'm not so certain that educators themselves have, or teachers in our primary and secondary schools or higher education. In fact, I think sometimes it's amazing that our students are getting taught at all. And yet every day there's pretty good educational programs taking place, not only in Indiana but around the country. But education is not the salvation for this, for international competitiveness. Business has got to understand that. Labor unions have to understand that. All of the other sectors of society that's going to make us competitive in this new global economy have got to understand that they also have to share some of the responsibility to bring us up to speed. Until that happens, sure, you can dump on education all you want and say that we educators are at fault. I'm not so certain that's the case. That's certainly not the total picture.
Let me just point out three quick things. Number one, we have a situation with demography in this country where the growth segment of our population really is among minority populations. And those students are much more apt to be what we call at risk. That is, that the likelihood of their being able to achieve at an acceptable level in the basics, if you will, is much less than what would be for a white middle-class population in our society. So that on the one hand, we have to keep in mind as we start setting all these standards that those standards are not going to change reality. They will raise expectations and they will provide some targets for us. But the reality of the matter is that a second issue is that it is not the schools alone that really affect what happens to a child. And thirdly, we have a different population in the schools today overall than was true 30 or 40 years ago when people try to make comparisons. We have made an exerted effort to keep children in school. We have particularly students staying on now beyond the age of 16, many students who 30 years ago never attempted to complete graduation. We have instilled in many of our people the notion that everyone ought to go on to college, and therefore that promotes the idea that everyone should come out of high school with certain kinds of skills. Well, what I'm getting at essentially is this, that regardless of the standards we set, it seems to me that we're facing a critical problem, a philosophical problem with our future in education, and that is how we are going to deal with a growing number of children who come to school without proper nutrition, who come from miserable family situations where there's one parent or no parent, where they do not have proper clothing, etc. Now, no matter what we do in the way of school reform, I'm not sure we're going to solve those problems. And so what I fear about what's going on now is that we're treating education, at least politically and economically, as if it were an island. And that by making improvements in the schoolhouse, we're going to solve a number of these societal problems.
Haven't we been that way for some time, though? I mean, haven't we counted on schools to do a lot of things that the homes increasingly have not done?
And yes, and that's growing. You know, we have many schools now in inner cities that provide breakfast, and appropriately so. It's the only place children are going to get a breakfast. The other thing is that there's a growing expectation at the other end of the spectrum with adult populations. Public schools increasingly are being expected to offer services to those adults who did not succeed as students. We have a high rate of literacy in this state itself.
You know, I thought I might focus upon student attitudes, and this survey comes from the Wall Street Journal. These are attitudes of college freshmen. 1967, 1985. Point number one, it is essential or very important to be very well off financially. In 1967, 44% believed in this. 1985, 71%. Point number two, It is essential or very important to develop a meaningful philosophy of life. 67, 83% thought this was very important. In 1985, 43%. Finally, number 3, the activities of married women are best confined to the home and family. 1967, 57%. 85, 22%. So we are really sort of dancing around the issue of values, and if this is any indication, the values of education seem to be kind of fuzzy. Does that ring a bell?
Well, I would, in looking just at these data, the value that the college freshmen have is that they want to get a good job and be well off financially. And perhaps one of the ways to do it is to make certain that their spouse works. That's kind of what these data show me. I'm not so certain that that's, I mean, some of the differences appear to be dramatic. But college freshmen, as you're well aware, are not in the baby boom generation. As they're coming through here in the next 4 years of their college experience, they're looking at a huge demographic bubble in front of them that already are into the job market and making their careers. These data do not really surprise me too much. There's other, as Ted was saying, there's other factors at work here that I think college freshmen are obviously responding to.
I would also suggest that we may be on the verge of another change and direction with regard to those values. I think as an increasing number of students go to college, receive a degree, and don't earn the money that they dream about, there will be a growing disenchantment with society and with education, much as there was in the late 60s that caused a different kind of reform to occur. I think one of the realities, getting back to original question about economics and education, is there are a lot of people in this country, very bright people, who are awakening to the fact that the baby boomers are now almost through the childbearing years. And if you look at a profile of population in the United States, it's almost like looking at a shadow of a snake that swallowed a huge rat, and that it's in the middle now and moving to the top. And so for just purely economic reasons, there's an awakening that the students who are now in school, starting school, are going to have to support a large segment of our society who are going to be on Social Security someday, etc. And so I think that's partially one of the reasons. It's an economic reality that if these people are not educated, do not become productive, we're going to face serious problems in this country.
Well, how well we're preparing people to go out and support all of us on Social Security later obviously is a question here. And one of the means that politicians want to use now is testing. Can you test progress? Can you test knowledge? Can you test how well a school, secondary or higher education educates, prepares its people for the world?
I think you can test to the degree to which they acquire certain kinds of skills. The difficulty becomes identifying all of the skills that are going to be necessary to get along in the world. Let me give you an example. What will we achieve if we produce students who are very good in the basic skills, but who are incapable of critical thinking, so they do not participate in government? So that increasingly our country moves in the direction of a very few people making decisions for all of us. See, and you don't hear much about how we're going to measure critical thinking skills in children. We sometimes select that which is easiest to measure, and that's outcomes in mathematics, etc. That's my big concern. We, in setting objectives, may be ignoring some issues that will be most important for life in the next century.
You know, one of the things I thought that President Reagan did in his address the other day was that he focused upon excellence, and he also focused upon civic education. And I think it's important in terms of the value system for young students to know the Constitution, and sometimes I think that we take some of this for granted. So he focused upon excellence, and of course the excellence translates not only for education, but it also translates for other industries, but also the focus upon civic education. And it seems as we we also need civic education because, as you say, we need people who participate in the system, because if you do not have people educated to vote, our democratic system doesn't work very well, or less well.
The political system is demanding in here some accountability from these institutions. I mean, there was the report in the New York Times article about legislatures linking university budgets to proof of teaching efficiency, to how much you learn. Is there a problem here of short-term political, I don't know, but politicians want some short-term positive results or else? I mean, the strength, it would seem, of our education system as set by public policy, by elected public officials, also would tend to be the weakness of it.
Well, Larry, I'd say there's some almost insidious logic in this, in which we encounter a major problem, whether it be Sputnik and the space race of 30 years ago versus our international competitiveness today, and public officials look around and they say, well, how are we going to address these problems? Well, here, a glowing button taking about 55% of the total state budget is education. And they know right away, public officials, that we can push that button and put all kinds of accountability checks in on it because we control it. And every family in this country rubs up against and has children in at one stage of their life or another, the public schools. It is a very tempting target for public officials to almost over-regulate, over-institutionalize public education. I think that is also a fear of educators. As some educators say, well, yeah, everybody thinks they're an expert on education because they all went to school. And to a large extent, that's a fallacy in public policy making, because we all remember our worst teachers and we all remember our best teachers, and that's all in our collective memories as a nation as well. So sometimes it's tempting to look at education as the solution for all of these things, when in fact, again, as educators, and I think we all agree here, it's only one part of the puzzle in terms of putting it all together and making us competitive economically, or getting us back on track in terms of the space race or what have you.
Well, exactly as Ted was saying earlier, that or it would imply, I mean, I'm inferring that from this, the governor or is saying, if we don't look at this, we're looking at economic disaster. But as you point, there are a lot more pieces to the puzzle here.
Well, see, it disturbs me a little bit. I'd be interested in what Ted thinks about this, but you can travel to Japan, you can travel to any of the other industrialized nations in the world, and we'd look at their test scores, and we look at our test scores, and we think, oh my goodness, we're terrible. We're not educationally up to date. These other school children are beating our socks off. That's really a glib comparison in my estimation. As a matter of fact, our values in the United States are totally different in terms of education vis-a-vis a Japan or a Great Britain or any other industrialized democracy. We made commitments in the early 19th century, and those values are pretty deep and inbred now in America. Those kind of comparisons, when Governor Orr says, well, I've been to Japan, I don't think we ought to make public policy necessarily on the basis of how our kids test against Japanese youngsters.
I would agree, and I think it's interesting that the two countries seem to be enamored with each other right now, both recognizing that there's something lacking in their system. We are making invidious comparisons with their achievement scores. They are looking at the fact that our children tend to be much more independent, speak up, are more active, etc. And I think each country would like to be able to combine a little of both into their educational system. I think one of the things we have to talk about too, and we talk about schools, and I am a great believer there's tremendous room for improvement in our schools, is that we are paying a price right now for a number of years of neglect, as you mentioned, in properly funding education. To improve schools, I firmly believe this, must be able to attract very talented individuals to the teaching profession. And as we face the next 25 years, we must also be able to attract very talented minority populations to the teaching profession. And we aren't going to do that unless we markedly improve the economic status and the social status and the degree to which teachers can share in the governance of their workplace. If we don't do those three things, I think all of our educational efforts are going to be quite limited.
But we have to back up the tough talk we're talking about. And of course, Governor Orr and the Indiana State Teachers Association have said we have to look at a tax increase. No doubt about it, right?
I would presume that's the case, and I think that's one of the reasons that the governor went to testify personally. I think he's saying we need this money, and I'm willing to do anything I can and to even raise taxes, which these gentlemen here could probably talk more about that than I, but you know, it seems to me that he's dead serious when he says he's willing to take a tax increase to get these things going.
No doubt about it.
It also seems that it's kind of like the pogo theory of the cartoon character. You know, we've looked at the problem and the problem is us, but perhaps both management and labor and all facets of society have come to the point to believe that there is a consensus behind change in education. Is this something we can be pleased about? That there is a consensus, a new consensus, even from the national perspective, for renewed focus upon education?
I was just last week with a group of about 22 superintendents of large school systems in this state, and one of the fears that they have is that we sometimes become critical of parts of reform packages which we don't like or can't accept, and in the process don't seize upon opportunities that may not be there very long. I guess what I'm saying is I do believe the country is in agreement that this is the proper time to really do something. And although we may not like a segment of the governor's package, etc., I think everyone who believes in educational improvement ought to get behind the notion that we need to inject more resources into our educational process in this state and not spend our time fighting over subparts of the package. I know there are many people that would disagree with that, but I don't like everything that's in the package either. But I do believe it's necessary that we support the improvement.
We're out of time. Thanks to our panelists Ted Kowalski, Ray Sheely, and John Rouse for their commentary. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for joining us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.